Chapter 9. Camp 2. April 28, 1996. 21,300 feet. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria which is our actual experience. Joan Didion, The White Album. I was already awake at 4 a.m. when the alarm on my wristwatch began to beep. I'd been awake most of the night, struggling for breath in the meager air. And now it was time to commence the dreaded ritual of emerging from the warmth of my goose-down cocoon into the withering cold of 21,300 feet. 2 days earlier, on Friday, April 26th, we'd humped all the way from base camp to Camp 2 in one long day to begin our third and final acclimatization sortie in preparation for the summit push. This morning, according to Rob's grand plan, we would climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 and spend a night at 24,000 feet. Rob had told us to be ready to leave at 4:45 sharp, 45 minutes hence, which allowed barely enough time to dress, force down a candy bar and some tea, and strap on my crampons. Shining my headlamp on a dime store thermometer, clipped to the parka I'd been using as a pillow, I saw that the temperature inside the cramped two-person tent was 7 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. "Doug!" I yelled at the lump burrowed in the sleeping bag beside me. "Time to get rolling, Slick. You awake over there?" "Awake," he rasped in a weary voice. "What makes you think I ever went to sleep? I feel like shit. I think something's wrong with my throat. Man, I'm getting too old for this stuff." During the night, our fetid exhalations had condensed on the tent fabric to form a fragile, interior sheath of hoarfrost. As I sat up and began rooting around in the dark for my clothing, it was impossible not to brush against the low nylon walls, and every time I did so, it instigated a blizzard inside the tent, covering everything with ice crystals. Shivering hard, I zipped my body into 3 layers of fuzzy polypropylene pile underwear and an outer shell of windproof nylon, then pulled my clunky plastic boots on. Yanking the laces tight made me wince in pain. For the past 2 weeks, the condition of my cracked, bleeding fingertips had been steadily deteriorating in the cold air. I tramped out of camp by headlamp behind Rob and Frank, wending between ice towers and piles of rock rubble to reach the main body of the glacier. For the next 2 hours, we ascended an incline pitched as gently as a beginner's ski slope, eventually arriving at the bergschrund that delineated the Khumbu Glacier's upper end. Immediately above rose the Lot's Face, a vast tilted sea of ice that gleamed like dirty chrome in the dawn's slanting light. Snaking down the frozen expanse as if suspended from heaven, a single strand of 9mm rope beckoned like Jack's beanstalk. I picked up the bottom end of it, attached my Jumar to the slightly frayed line, and began to climb. A Jumar is a wallet-sized device that grips the rope by means of a metal cam. The cam allows the Jumar to slide upward without hindrance, but it pinches the rope securely when the device is weighted. Essentially ratcheting himself upward, a climber thereby ascends the rope. I'd been uncomfortably cold since leaving camp, having underdressed in anticipation of the solar oven effect that had occurred every other morning when the sun hit the western Khum. But on this morning the temperature was held in check by a biting wind that gusted down from the upper mountain, creating a wind chill that dipped to perhaps 40 below 0. I had an extra pile sweater in my backpack, but to put it on I would first have to remove my gloves, pack, and wind jacket while dangling from the fixed rope. Worrying that I was likely to drop something, I decided to wait until I reached a part of the face that was less steep, where I could stand in balance without hanging from the rope. So I continued climbing, and as I did so I grew colder and colder. The wind kicked up huge swirling waves of powder snow that washed down the mountain like breaking surf, plastering my clothing with frost. A carapace of ice formed over my goggles, making it difficult to see. I began to lose feeling in my feet. My fingers turned to wood. It seemed increasingly unsafe to keep going up in these conditions. I was at the head of the line, at 23,000 feet, 15 minutes in front of guide Mike Groom. I decided to wait for him and talk things over. But just before he reached me, Rob's voice barked over the radio mic carried inside his jacket, and he stopped climbing to answer the call. "Rob wants everybody to go down," he declared, shouting to make himself heard above the wind. "We're getting out of here." It was noon by the time we arrived back at Camp 2 and took stock of the damage. I was tired but otherwise fine. John Task, the Australian doctor, had some minor frostnip on the tips of his fingers. Doug, on the other hand, had suffered some serious harm. When he removed his boots, he discovered incipient frostbite on several toes. On Everest in 1995, he'd frostbitten his feet badly enough to lose some tissue from a big toe and permanently impair his circulation, making him particularly susceptible to cold. Now this additional frostbite would make him yet more vulnerable to the cruel conditions of the upper mountain. Even worse, however, was the injury to Doug's respiratory tract. Less than 2 weeks before departing for Nepal, he had undergone minor throat surgery, leaving his trachea in an extremely sensitive condition. This morning, gasping lungfuls of caustic snow-filled air, he had apparently frozen his larynx. "I'm done," Doug croaked in a barely audible whisper, looking crushed. "I can't even talk. The climb is over for me." "Don't write yourself off just yet, Douglas," Rob offered. "Wait and see how you feel in a couple of days. You're a tough bastard. I think you've still got a good shot at the top once you recover." Unconvinced, Doug retreated to our tent and pulled his sleeping bag over his head. It was rough seeing him so discouraged. He'd become a good friend, unstintingly sharing the wisdom he'd gained during his failed attempt on the peak in 1995. Around my neck I wore a sea stone, a sacred Buddhist amulet blessed by the Lama from the Pangboche Monastery that Doug had given me early on in the expedition. I wanted him to reach the summit almost as badly as I wanted to reach it myself. An air of shock and mild depression hovered over the camp for the remainder of the day. Even without unleashing the worst it could dish out, the mountain had sent us scurrying for safety. And it wasn't just our team that was chastened and doubtful. Morale seemed to be at a low ebb for several of the expeditions at Camp 2. The bad humor was most apparent in the bickering that broke out between Hall and the leaders of the Taiwanese and South African teams over sharing responsibility for stringing more than a mile of rope that was needed to safeguard the route up the Lhotse face. By late April, a line of ropes had already been fixed between the head of the Coombe and Camp 3, halfway up the face. To complete the job, Hall, Fisher, Ian Woodall, Makalu Gao, and Todd Burleson had agreed that on April 26th, 1 or 2 members from each team would join forces and put ropes up the remainder of the face, the passage between Camp 3 and 26,000-foot Camp 4. But it hadn't happened as planned. When Ang Dorje and Lakbachiri from Hall's team, guide Anatoly Bukrev from Fisher's team, and one Sherpa from Burleson's team departed Camp 2 on the morning of April 26th, the Sherpas, who were supposed to join them from the South African and Taiwanese teams, stayed in their sleeping bags and refused to cooperate. That afternoon, when Hall arrived at Camp 2 and learned of this, he immediately made some radio calls to find out why the plan had broken down. Kami Dorje Sherpa, the climbing Sirdar for the Taiwanese team, apologized profusely and promised to make amends. But when Hall raised Woodall on the radio, the impenitent South African expedition leader responded with a barrage of obscenities and insults. "Let's keep it civil, mate," Hall implored. "I thought we had an agreement." Woodall replied that his Sherpas stayed in their tents only because nobody came around to wake them up and tell them their assistance was needed. Hall shot back that Ang Dorje had in fact tried repeatedly to rouse them, but they had ignored his entreaties. At that point, Woodall declared, "Either you're a bloody liar or your Sherpa is." Then he threatened to send over a couple of Sherpas from his team to sort out Ang Dorje with their fists.